Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Christmas lecture, which also happened by complete coincidence to be our 50th online talk. So that's a great milestone. 50 talks in 5 years. That's a great milestone. And we're very happy to have with us Frank James. Now, you may recall, you perhaps looked at them when you were younger, maybe you still do, but the Royal Institution has a Christmas lecture every year, and we all know, well, I hope we all know, that it was started by Michael Faraday. And this, of course, is Frank is going to be talking about one of Michael's greatest topics, the chemical history of a candle, but I'm jumping ahead here because I'm going to first give Frank a few minutes to talk about himself and how he came to give this talk, if it were. Over to you, Frank.
So I'm Frank James. I'm a professor of history of science at University College London, and before that I worked at the Royal Institution where I edited Faraday's correspondence in 6 volumes, and in the course of that, especially in the last volume, I came across the correspondence relating to Faraday's chemical history of a candle, and I'll be saying later on that this is perhaps the most popular science book ever published, certainly in English, and look at the reasons why Faraday gave the lectures, something about the content of the lectures. So if I was doing this live, I would try and do some experimental demonstrations, but since I'm not live in a live audience, I can't do that. And finally, how they came to be published and something about the publication history. I think that's all I need to say.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Thank you very much for that. And I formally invite you, Frank, to talk about Michael Faraday, the chemical history of a candle. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, this is not Michael Faraday, this is Humphrey Davy. And the reason why I have put this up is that today happens to be Humphrey Davy's birthday. And I hope all the pupils at Penzance in the Humphrey Davy Grammar School, Comprehensive School at Penzance are celebrating. Certainly there was a procession through Penzance town last Friday, and you can sort of look at some of the spectacular photographs of that on the Cornish News Network. But I'm going to be talking about this man, Michael Faraday. This is a photograph by Moll Polyblank of him, taken sometime in the mid-1850s, so at the same sort of time as the lectures that I'm going to be talking about were delivered. Now, both Davy and Faraday worked at the Royal Institution, then as now in Albemarle Street, founded in 1799 by luminaries such as Joseph Banks, President of the Royal Society of London, Thomas Bernard in the centre, and Max Graf von Rumford on the bottom right. And the Royal Institution was originally intended to provide lectures to its aristocratic members. So by about the sort of end of the 1810s, it became a much more middle class organisation with members rather than proprietors. And the other thing it was aimed to do, somewhat less successfully, I have to say, was provide scientific advice to the state and its agency. Well, in order to maintain a lecture program, it built an enormous lecture theatre, which those of you who have seen the Christmas lectures on television over the past 40, 50 years will be very familiar with. The original drawing by Thomas Webster on the left, and what the lecture theatre looked like at the end of the 19th century, in the 1890s. This theatre was demolished in the 1920s, and what we actually see now is a theatre as constructed in the 1930s, but to very much the same sort of ground plan. And it was in this theatre, this one here, that Davy and Faraday established the Royal Institution's excellence for scientific lectures. Davy lectured in the first decade of the 19th century, very attractive, very charismatic lecturer, lots of explosions, lots of bangs, lots of women in the audience admiring Davy. And Faraday, in a sort of rather different key, while different sort of note, was an equally effective lecturer, giving discourses and the Christmas lectures. But he was also did other roles within the Royal Institution. It was Davy who appointed him as lecture and laboratory assistant in 1813 after Faraday had applied to him for a job at the RI in a really complex set of circumstances, which I don't have time to go into. He became superintendent of the House, acting in 1821, acting in place of William Thomas Brand, who held that position. But since Brand was away a lot of the time, doing work for the Royal Mint, providing scientific advice to water companies and so on and so forth, a lot of the basic administration of the RI fell onto Faraday's shoulders. And this was recognised in 1826 when he was appointed assistant, again assistant to Brand, but really in charge. So basically he was what we now call the chief executive of the Royal Institution, where he was also director of the laboratory and became Fullerian Professor of Chemistry in 1833. There's not a coincidence, I think, that in the mid-1820s, 2 new lecture courses were begun at the Royal Institution. The 5-day evening discourses, where very distinguished, eminent men, and they were all men in the 19th century, came to talk about various aspects of science and other areas of culture. And that became a really important vehicle for transmitting scientific knowledge to a broad community throughout the 19th and well into the 20th century. And also the founding of the Christmas lectures at exactly the same time, 1825, 1826. Now, we actually know very little about the founding of the Christmas lectures. They just suddenly start appearing in 1825, 26. No evidence has been found that Faraday was responsible, though one has, as I sort of suggested, it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that Faraday was heavily involved. It's just that the evidence hasn't survived. And the advert for the first set of Christmas lectures appeared in the Times exactly 199 years ago today, as you can see, which I had not realized until I sort of got this, was putting this presentation together. And it's advertised as a juvenile, as lectures adapted for a juvenile auditory. And the first lecturer was John Millington, a figure who's not particularly well known today, but in the sort of 1810s, 1820s, was professor of mechanical science at the Royal Institution, and does tend to pop up in all sorts of circumstances at that time. He later went to South America to manage a silver mine, and ended his days in Virginia, so actually dying during the Civil War in the United States. Now that's not a very clear slide of the advert in time. So here's a transcription of it. A course of lecture should be delivered at the Royal Institution in the Christmas and other vacations on some of the leading branches of natural philosophy adapted to the comprehension of a juvenile auditory. John Millington will deliver a course of 22 lectures to commence on Monday, the 19th of December at 2 o'clock, and to be regularly continued till completion of the 15th lecture. The remainder of the course will be delivered in the Easter and Whitsuntide vacations. Well, for Millington, this is absolutely standard pattern for RI lectures at the time. A sort of course of 10, 15, 20 lectures delivered over a sort of period of time. But Millington did deliver the Easter and Whitsun lectures, but thereafter those were dispensed with, one assumes because audience size wasn't particularly good. And Christmas lectures very quickly came down to 6 lectures delivered over Christmas and New Year. And that format of 6 lectures each year was maintained until the I think 1980s, when the pressure of television started reducing the number of lectures, first to 5 and now to 3, and so on. And this is the first list. This is a list of the first sort of 10 or so lectures. Faraday actually gives the 3rd series, and some of the others are, again, like Millington, not that well known today. Very little known about John Wallace. Sometimes it's spelled Wallace. I haven't found anything about Wood. Rennie is well known. Thomas Webster, whom I mentioned earlier, was the architect of the RI conversion from a gentleman's townhouse into a scientific institution. And he was also secretary of the Geological Society, hence his lectures on geology. And Brand, as I mentioned earlier, who's officially Faraday's boss, gave a series on chemistry. In total, Faraday gave 19 series of Christmas lectures, which is quite a burden. To put it into a sort of more recent context, since 1945, only 3 people have delivered 2 courses of lectures. It is really quite a massive effort to deliver these lectures. So what Faraday did, as I suppose we all do, is to recycle old lecture material. So his Chemical History of Candle, he first delivered in 1848-9. He then delivered it again in 1854-5, but its series was Chemistry of Combustion, but it's exactly the same lecture course, same notebook was used. And then finally, the really famous series, his final set of Christmas lectures in 1860-61, and he returned to the title Chemical History of a Candle. And here's Faraday delivering one of his Christmas lectures in the 1850s. I can't remember. It's one of the mid-1850s. It's not his Chemical History of a Candle lecture in front of the Prince Consort, the Prince of Wales on the Consort's right, and Prince Alfred not paying as much attention as one would hope on the Prince's left. This was painted by Alexander Blakely, who was a fellow Sandemanian of Faraday's, and is perhaps one of the most widely reproduced images of the lecture theatre and of Faraday lecturing. It was very quickly published as an engraving in the Illustrated London News. So by the time the end of the 1850s came about, Faraday was actively seeking to retire, to lay down some of his duties, not only within the RI, but also out with the RI, for example, Sandemanian duties, scientific advisor Trinity House, and so on, none of which with any success. People were so keen to keep Faraday, they just kept plugging on, and Faraday, being a sort of fairly acquiescent sort of man, sort of didn't, until fairly late on, sort of removed a number of positions from his portfolio. But he was getting old, and there's a sort of wonderful emblem of this of getting old. And this is a photograph taken on the 30th of June 1860 by Charles Dodgson, better known nowadays as Lewis Carroll, author of the Alice stories, but a very, very keen amateur photographer. And when the British Association met in Oxford that year, he got all the really famous savants up in his rooms in Christchurch to photograph them, and this is the one of Faraday. Faraday had his photograph taken by Dodgson and then left for London around lunchtime, which meant that he missed the debate between Huxley, Wilberforce, and Hooker over the validity of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, published the previous year. That departure from Oxford is, I take it as emblematic of Faraday standing back from the sort of new ideas of modern science. It wasn't that he wasn't interested, he just didn't have the energy to maintain. But that's not how other people saw him. The Illustrated London News, in a profile of Faraday, discusses his Christmas lectures in 1861. For the last, the last 8 seasons, Professor Faraday has undertaken this task, that is the Christmas lectures, with a modesty and a power which it is impossible to praise too much. There can be no greater treat to anyone fond of scientific pursuits than to attend a course of these lectures. But there were problems in the RI, so nothing new there. And it was to do with John Barlow, seen here on the left. Barlow was secretary of the Royal Institution and had been since the early 1840s, and was sort of beginning to get fed up with running the RI. It's very, very opaque what actually happened. But Faraday wrote to the chemist William Crookes, of whom more later, that I had wished to cease lecturing altogether, but circumstances, that is, Barlow's resignation, induced me to consent for the season, that is the coming season, 1860-61. The wish on any account to withdraw is a trouble to me in some sense, for I really have had great pleasure in talking to the children. However, I will do my best. So basically what Faraday was saying is that if he stopped lecturing at the same time as Barlow resigning as secretary, there would be significant issues and discussions within and out with the Royal Institution. And so he decided to stay on and give this final set of lectures. And his wife, Sarah Faraday, makes this very clear in a letter to her nephew, George Buchanan, where she says, it was thought not good for your uncle to give up anything he could keep at the same time. And I think that sort of keep at the same time indicates that what Faraday said in the previous quotation, that he actually enjoyed talking to children at their level. Now this, as you can see, is very late. The letter was written on 16th of November 1860. Christmas lectures were due to begin the end of the following month. So no time to write a new course of lectures. And so Faraday did, as I indicated earlier, recycle his material from earlier lectures. So this is the lecture card for the first Christmas lectures on the candle in 48, then the combustion lectures in 54, and finally the lecture program for 60-61 to begin on the 27th of December and run through to the 8th of January. And when I say Faraday used the same notebook, that is exactly what he did. This is a page from that notebook, which, by the way, I reproduced in facsimile in my sesquicentenary edition of Chemical History of Candle. And as you can see, this notebook did get a bit too close to a candle flame or some sort of flame at some point in one of those free courses of lectures. And again, this is an absolutely typical piece of Faraday's structuring his lectures. On the right, you've got the narrative of the sort of headlines of what he's going to talk about, and on the left, you've got the list of experiments or demonstrations that he's going to do related to that page, and they are tied in. So it's about a third of the way down. You see a number 9 on the right hand side, and then on the left hand side you see the I think it says scorched ring on white paper. So just sort of showing the sort of experiments is going to go with the particular heading in this case to illustrate the power of heat of the flame. So I'm now going to turn to the content of these lectures, or at least some of the content of these lectures. I said if I was doing this in a sort of live audience, I would sort of actually do some of the demonstrations. So he would use resources of the RI, like Robert Hooke's Micrographia, which has this wonderful image of how a candle flame looks when you put it under high magnification. And he's will bring out the RI's copy of Micrographia and show his audience the image. There is clearly a problem because although this image is a really large folio image, it's really not going to be visible right at the back of the theatre, and I'm not quite sure how that sort of issue was overcome. Faraday, like lecturers to this day, drew on past work done in the Royal Institution, so particularly Davy's work on sodium and potassium, which Davy had done before Faraday was appointed to the Royal Institution. So on the right-hand side, you have the Davy's laboratory notebook, recording down at the bottom, proving the decomposition of potash. And Faraday would do that experiment with the sort of apparatus that Davy had actually used, some of which can be seen on the left-hand side. And in that sort of classic experiment, Faraday would drop sodium or potassium or both into a bowl of water and watch the combustion going on. Faraday also talked about the Davy's miner's safety lamp, which he had a role in working on, probably quite a significant role in 1815-16, again showing how combustion can be retained and controlled. And also this sort of really interesting idea of what Faraday called the philosopher's candle. It's the only place I've ever come across the philosopher's candle where you have zinc immersed in sulfuric acid at the bottom of the tube. Hydrogen is produced, goes up through the tube, and you light it. And I have to say that's not a very strong effect. So I can only assume they dimmed the lights completely in the theatre so that people could see the flame. Now, one of Faraday's points about talking about a candle was that from that really simple device, from the flame, which was familiar to everyone. I mean, nowadays candles are used for leisure purposes, for recreation, for producing perfumes and things like that. Very few candles are used for practical purposes. They're sort of decorative more than anything else now. But in the 1860s, candles were a very, very important source of light, and everybody was familiar with a candle. So Faraday is taking a device, an entity that was familiar to everybody in the audience, and from that constructing an entire cosmology and visiting every bit of science you can think of related to a candle. So he repeats the Magdeburg experiments conducted by Guericke in the late 17th century, where allegedly you have a evacuated evacuated sphere made up of two semispheres, evacuated using an air pump, and horses cut, and a sort of team of 6 horses on either side, was 8 horses on either side, can't pull the sphere to pieces. Now, Faraday did this on a smaller scale, but it makes the point. And Faraday actually gets it right, which so many people don't get right in understanding this experiment. That's the pressure on the external pressure of the air on the cylinders that keep them together, not in some sense a vacuum within the spheres. And Faraday can strike at times really very modern notes, which I think is one of the reasons why the candle is still read not only by people like me out of historical interest, but by scientists and students and so on. So he says a man in 24 hours converts as much as 7 ounces of carbon into carbonic acid. That carbonic acid is carbon dioxide. That was the term was used in the mid-19th century. A milk cow will convert 70 ounces and a horse 79 ounces solely by the act of respiration. That is, the horse in 24 hours burns 79 ounces of charcoal or carbon in his organs of respiration to supply his natural warmth at that time. And what an extraordinary notion this gives us, the alterations going on in our atmosphere. As much as 5 million pounds or 548 tons of carbonic acid is formed by respiration in London alone in 24 hours. And where does all this go? Up into the air. Now, Faraday, though he was working opposite John Tyndall, who was Professor of Natural Philosophy at the RI at this point, Faraday did not draw the conclusion that Tyndall was about to draw, that carbon dioxide was what we would now call a greenhouse gas. Tyndall doesn't call it a greenhouse gas. It's Arrhenius at the end of the century that calls it greenhouse gases. But Tyndall describes quite precisely the phenomenon of greenhouse gases, and he uses this apparatus, really complex apparatus on the left, to show the different absorbent powers of different gases. And so almost at the same time, you have Faraday commenting on the amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, and Tyndall showing that this has quite serious consequences, which I'm afraid to say is only today we're beginning to address them in a really serious way. And Faraday makes it very clear right from the beginning of the lectures that there is not a law under which any part of this universe is governed which does not come into play and is touched upon in these phenomena. These phenomena being the combustion of a candle. So Faraday takes the candle and from there goes to all sorts of physical, physiological, universal phenomena. It's a quite remarkable achievement. Faraday, until the 1860s, refused permission, which he asked several times by publishers to publish the text of his lectures. He wrote to a publisher called Smith. It was proposed to take them, that's Crookes' lectures, by shorthand, and so save me trouble. But I knew that would be a thorough failure. Even if I cared to give time to the revision of the manuscript, still the lectures without the experiments and the vivacity of speaking would fall far behind those in the lecture room as to effect. So the question is, why, for the Crookes lectures, did Faraday completely change his mind and agree to their being published? Well, the answer to that lies in the craze of spiritualism which began in the early 1850s. From 1853 onwards, you had table turning. Tables would sort of start to move around of their own volition, apparently. There's even a sort of wonderful description of Baroness Bunsen, the wife of the Prussian ambassador, saying the table flew out of a window in Carlton House Terrace, where the Royal Society of London now has its headquarters, and flew back in. Faraday was asked by many people what was the scientific background to these phenomena. And Faraday took it seriously, attended a couple of seances, and concluded that what was happening was that when people put their hands on a table, their fingers became numb, and they weren't aware that they were involuntarily moving the table themselves. And to show this up completely, Faraday invented this very clever device where you had some rollers in this is 2 plates of wood with some rollers below, between the 2 plates of wood. And when the people put their hands on the wood, it did not move because the pointers stopped it from moving. So the people working this perceived the stillness of the indicator, and suddenly tables stopped turning. This caused a huge row. I mean, Faraday's post bag up until this point had been fairly high. After this point, it became huge. I mean, people like Elizabeth Barrett Browning was appalled that sort of Faraday was sort of questioning the validity of table turning and of spiritualism, and said so. And what had happened basically was that both Faraday's scientific sensibility and his religious sensibility had been deeply offended by this craze. And he came to believe, and he said so quite clearly in a lecture in 1854, that there was something seriously wrong with the education system in this country, which could allow otherwise perfectly well-educated and rational people to hold such irrational views. And so I think by the time it came to the publishing of the Christmas lectures, Faraday was in a bit of a bind, because if he kept on refusing to publish these lectures, he would not be able to sort of sustain his claims because he wasn't willing to do anything about publishing good, sound science. And so that, I think, is why he moved towards publishing his lectures. And the person who was responsible for this, ironically, in view of his own later commitment to spiritualism, was William Crookes. At this point, Crookes was editor of the Weekly Chemical News, and it had only just begun. It was sort of struggling to produce an issue of about sort of 12, sometimes 16 pages a week. And what Crookes would do was go down, get one of his assistants to go down to the Royal Institution and take lecture notes in shorthand and then publish them. And as a typical RI lecture would sort of take 2 or 3 pages. So you're sort of filling up an issue of Chemical News, a quarter of an issue of Chemical News with an RI lecture. And he would collect these lectures and put them together into books. And the first one he did was Faraday's lecture series of the previous year, 1859-60, a course of 6 lectures on the various forces of matter. Now, unlike the Chemical History of Candle, which has a certain sort of universal quality over time, Faraday's lecture on the various forces of matter is a really specific product of its age. It has not worn well. And so when Chemical History of Candle came, Crookes had shorthand notes taken, and Faraday really couldn't have had too much to say about how they were produced, because the first lecture was published in Chemical News on January the 5th. That is just over a week after it had been delivered, and there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that Faraday had any say in the final text that appeared in the newspaper. And the lecture was the Chemical News crossed the Atlantic, and it was published in the Scientific American at the height of the Civil War in the United States. Crookes took it up, as he did with Forces of Matter, and published it as a book. And that appeared in 1861. And from then till today, it has never been out of print in English. I have occasionally tried to count the number of English editions, but it's impossible. There are just so many of them. And one of the problems with the Candle is it's a popular book, and popular books tend not to be collected in different editions by a major repository. So there are always other editions to be found. And I have to say, I was responsible to mark the 60th centenary in 2011 of the first publication of Chemical Crystal Candle by producing a sesquicentenary edition with a sort of reset text, and as I mentioned earlier, the facsimile of Faraday's notes. And it's not only in English that Chemical Crystal Candle has flourished. It's been translated into Japanese and into Portuguese. I advised on the Japanese edition. I've got absolutely no clue about whether they took my advice or not, but I do know what my name now looks like in Chinese and in Japanese characters. And it has also been published in many other languages, some not obvious. I mean, I'd be interested to know what a Latvian translation looks like, or a Korean translation. And according to some of my contacts, particularly in Japan, Chemical Crystal Candle is still regarded as a book to give to students to read. That sort of universal quality transcends not only time, but also space and culture. And this came to the attention of Jane Gregory and Steve Miller, who were colleagues of mine at University College, and they wrote a really significant book on science communication called Science in Public, and there they devote a whole chapter to Faraday's Chemical Crystal Candle as a way of communicating science. And indeed, when I was first at University College, Steve and I each Christmas did a lecture based on Faraday's Christmas candle lectures at UCL, which were amazingly well attended, I have to say. And so it was Faraday performing in the lecture theatre of the Royal Institution, with access to all the resources, apparatus, instruments, that drew the theatre to public attention. And so it appeared quite prominently on a £20 note issued by the Bank of England in the 1990s. And with that, I think I shall conclude, and happy to sort of answer any questions anyone may have. Peter, are you there?
I was muted. I didn't realise. Can you all hear and see me now? I'm terribly sorry about that. I was whittling away and I didn't realise I was muted. Whether that was a good or bad thing, I'll leave you to decide. Anyway, thank you very much. Thanks. An excellent talk, fascinating in its detail. We've got a few questions coming up. I'll just try to put a couple myself, one of which is not strictly about this lecture. The famous remark that everybody associates with Faraday, or at least I think many people associate with Faraday, is that when he was asked what was the use of electricity, he said, "What was the use of a newborn baby?" Is that a genuine quotation from Faraday?
Yes, he uses it twice. Once in a lecture to the City Philosophical Society in the 1810s, and once elsewhere, which I forget. But he's quoting Benjamin Franklin when he was American ambassador to Paris in the 1780s, when Montgolfier balloons went up, and somebody asked Franklin what use was these balloons, and that's what he said: "What use is a newborn baby?" And that has a European bon mot, and is extremely well known. And so Faraday's not being original, but he is copying Franklin.
Okay, so we know that he cribs off other people. We all do that. Anyway, Now my other question concerns the lectures that appeared in Chemical Use. Now, I know about this sort of thing very well because you may know, Frank, of course, that Henry Roscoe's lectures on spectrum analysis appeared in the British Medical Journal of all places until I think they decided it had nothing to do with medicine, despite being given at the Society of Apothecaries, and they stopped doing it. But any noise there. But did the publishers ever ask the speaker for permission? Did Crookes ask Faraday for permission to?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, Crookes couldn't have done that without permission, and that was the point I was trying to make, that Faraday changed his mind completely about allowing shorthand journalists into the theatre to take down his every word. Because up until that point, in one letter he says he was offered almost unlimited terms for the lectures, and turned it down. But when after the sort of row over table turning and spiritualism happened, he just he said to Crookes, "Okay, let's get on with it."
Okay. One slightly complicated question here from Cliff Lee. He said that Faraday talks, at least the last lot of talks, spanned the period when paraffin wax candles were replacing tallow candles. Did Faraday mention this at all, and did he go into oil refining and where the paraffin came from? I don't think they would really that quite.
He does mention different varieties of candle. I mean, some really quite obscure ones. I'm sure he must discuss paraffin candles, but I couldn't actually swear to it. But I mean, in the first lecture, he does talk a lot about sort of reed candles and wax candles and beeswax and so on.
It was more about the basic principles, wasn't it, rather than the sort of what you might call the background of candles.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the question here: was there ever a Yiddish edition of the chemical history of the candle?
Not that I've come across, although as I sort of listed on my list, there was a Hebrew.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah, there was a Hebrew edition published in 1966. But as I know, Hebrew is not the same as Yiddish, so I have no idea. I mean, it'd be nice to know if there was a Yiddish one. I mean, there's apparently a Dutch one, which didn't make it on that list. I mean, this is not a comprehensive list by any stretch of imagination.
Yeah, WorldCat. I suppose you can probably pick up a lot of them on WorldCat, can't you?
You can pick up a lot of them, certainly, but not everything.
Yeah.
Because you have this problem that libraries do not necessarily collect material like chemical history candle. I think there's a sort of tendency to view this sort of publication as ephemeral, and they don't sort of collect it with the same rigor that the British Library would collect.
Yeah. The comment had been made that he must have been a very charismatic speaker. Is there anybody you would compare him with today?
Actually, I mean, somebody like Roger Penrose would be quite a good comparison. I've been to quite a few of Penrose's lectures, and Penrose is the sort of lecturer that when you're listening to him in the lecture theatre, you think you understand everything he's saying. You get outside the door and you think, what on earth was that about? And you get exactly the same thing with Faraday. You get people saying, oh, went to a wonderful lecture by Faraday, understood every word of it until I got outside and thought, what on earth was that about? So and Penrose is a really charismatic figure after all.
Yeah. I've never heard Penrose speak. You've given me the opportunity.
Oh, it's worth going. I mean, I once went to a lecture he gave, in the course of which he realised he made an arithmetical error by putting root 2 under an equation, and when he took it away, the size of the universe had doubled by the end of the lecture.
I remember I once went to a lecture at the time with him. I'm not quite sure who gave it now. I mean, was it Brian Cox or somebody else? But it was about membrane. It was about that sort of quantum mechanical thing called membrane and stuff like that. And not membrane that you would use in biology and whatever. And I remember it was very confusing because I've Graham Farmelo alongside me trying to explain to me what he was talking about at the same time. It's got, no,
No, that should be reserved for after the lecture, not during the lecture.
yeah, yeah. Well, maybe it might have been afterwards, actually. Okay, one more question, I think, here. A very similar question in a way. Did Faraday Christmas lectures inspire similar discourse across the UK or globally?
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, not necessarily Faraday's lectures, but the sort of basic idea of the Christmas lectures has been imitated and repeated all over the place. I mean, I've seen Christmas lectures in New Zealand. As I said, Steve Bill and I did a Christmas lecture at UCL for a couple of years. There was a series at the Open University. So not necessarily Faraday, but the sort of idea of giving Christmas lectures for young people has certainly been repeated.
I don't know if we've got any more questions from the audience, but I mean, has anybody else ever tried to take a single simple phenomenon like burning a candle and claim that every physical in the universe is present here? I mean, that's a very audacious thing to say. I'm not sure, to be perfectly honest.
It is a bit, yeah.
Has anybody else tried something like that?
Well, George Porter sort of tried it a bit because Faraday was Porter's hero, and he gave a set of lectures called The Natural History of the Sunbeam, which is the same sort of idea. And being Porter, they were really good lectures because he like Faraday, spent an awful lot of time getting the demonstrations and the text to work in complete harmony.
Yeah, yeah. Good example. Perhaps another example of somebody who would like Faraday in his day. Yes. Well, thank you very much, Frank. An absolutely appropriate topic for a Christmas lecture. You've now given your own Christmas lecture, and we all thank you very much for giving it and for giving us such a good time. We had up to about 70 odd people at one point, which I think is a record for this past year. Not quite a record for the whole series, and deep in the lockdown, we did have about 80 people sometimes, but nonetheless, an absolutely splendid turnout. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming out when you've probably got much better things to do with Christmas coming up, if only collecting the turkey or something. And thank you for attending. Now, next month in January, there's been a slight change of plan. It's now going to be by Helen Crookes, who will be talking about an apothecary in Nantwich in Cheshire who existed back in the 17th century and uncovered his record, an inventory of his shop, and I believe it's absolutely fascinating. So do come back to us in January, same time, 3rd January, 3rd Tuesday of the month, 2 o'clock, right here, online, to hear about a Nantwich apothecary in the 17th century. But for now, we thank Frank again, I thank you again, and I hope you have a very jolly Christmas and a good year. Bye, everybody. Merry Christmas.